Ocean.
Have a joyous holiday season from all of us at Today.
I believe things happen for a reason, and I hope the long wait of the last 5 weeks will heighten a desire to move beyond the bitterness and partisanship of the recent past. Our nation must rise above a house divided. Americans share hopes and goals and values far more important than any political disagreements. Republicans want the best for our nation, and so do Democrats. Our votes may differ, but not our hopes.
Good morning. Finally, a president-elect. George W. Bush will become the 43rd president of the United States. The transition begins in earnest today, Thursday, December 14th, 2000.
From NBC News, this is Today with Katie Couric and Matt Lauer. Live from Studio 1A in Rockefeller Plaza.
And good morning. Welcome to Today on this Thursday morning. I'm Matt Lauer.
And I'm Katie Couric. 37 days after Americans went to the polls, and now we have a winner. Now it can be said, President-elect Bush.
He is the first son to follow his father to the presidency since the Adamses. The first president, by the way, since 1888 to have lost the popular vote and still win the White House. Bush and the current vice president, Al Gore, spoke to the nation last night after Gore formally conceded in a telephone call. Now this morning, just a few minutes ago in London, the current president offered these words, first on Al Gore.
He spoke for all of us last night. And he did it eloquently and well. And President-elect Bush responded with generosity and kind, I thought, in his remarks. And I think we ought to use this opportunity to let the country come together and try to get the new administration off to a good start.
That was President Clinton speaking this morning in London.
The two speeches last night were the first steps in trying to heal a divided country. And an NBC News Reuters poll out this morning finds that the country is still split over all of this. Many wonder whether the weeks of courtroom wrangling have sown doubts about Mr. Bush's legitimacy. Here's what we found. 59% of the people we spoke with said Bush's presidency is legitimate. 37% said it is not. But when we asked whether the country will come together, 50% said no, 46% said yes. And when we asked about this week's U.S. Supreme Court decision that ultimately ended this drama, 48% said it was politically motivated. 43% said it was objective. Matt?
Katie, we're going to look at last night's speeches from every angle, also look at what's ahead. Let's begin with the man who's covering President-elect Bush. That's NBC's David Gregory, who's in Austin, Texas this morning. David, good morning to you.
Matt, good morning. His mandate in doubt, President-elect Bush seeks to overcome the bitterness of this contested election by reaching out to Al Gore and to a nation, he says, invoking Lincoln, must now rise above a house divided.
My friend, the President-elect of the United States, the Honorable George W. Bush.
It was intended to be a deeply symbolic speech. Bush, the eldest son of a president, before hundreds of supporters in the Texas Capitol, introduced by the state's House Speaker, a Democrat, a signal to a weary country that it's time for consensus.
I know America wants reconciliation and unity. I know Americans want progress, and we must seize this moment and deliver. I was not elected to serve one party, but to serve one nation.
Calling the past 5 weeks a, quote, long and trying period, Bush praised the vice president for his service and convictions. Recalling Gore's concession phone call, which came just 8 minutes before the vice president's address, Bush said they agreed to meet next Tuesday in Washington.
And I thank him for a call that I know was difficult to make.
Promising diligent work on his core agenda, education improvement, Social Security and Medicare reform, and tax cuts, Bush touted his compassionate conservative philosophy.
Together we will address some of society's deepest problems, one person at a time, by encouraging and empowering the good hearts and good works of the American people.
But Bush also appeared humble, mindful of the fact that while he prevailed in the closest election in more than a century, he lost the popular vote.
Whether you voted for me or not, I will do my best to serve your interests, and I will work to earn your respect.
Cheered by supporters in Austin, Bush also received congratulations from foreign leaders, including British Prime Minister Blair, who sympathized in a message to Bush, quote, "It was a long and agonizing wait for you." But now the wait is over. The country's 43rd president, aides say, will resign as Texas governor within days and work quickly to appoint a cabinet now just 36 days before his inauguration.
Aides say Bush will begin his first full day as president-elect in church. And they also say that he is expected to name his top White House staff positions by as early now as tomorrow. And later today in Washington, the government is expected to officially turn over $5.3 million in transition funds and those long-awaited keys to the new administration's temporary offices in Washington. Matt?
That's right, David. They were a bone of contention. David Gregory in Austin, Texas this morning. Thank you very much. Let's bring our Washington bureau chief and moderator of Meet the Press in, Tim Russer. Tim, good morning to you.
Good morning, Matt.
We talked about tone yesterday. We talked about how important tone was in this speech. He wasn't gloating. He didn't celebrate a lot. Compassionate, reconciliation. What'd you think?
Actually a bit humble, very earnest, very sincere, and I dare say presidential. Matt, I thought the most important line in this speech was, "I will work to earn your respect." George W. Bush knows that this is an exceedingly uphill struggle for him to achieve the presidency. He does not have a mandate. The Senate is deadlocked between Democrats and Republicans. He has a bare majority in the House. It is going to have to be a centrist, moderate agenda in order for him to achieve anything. He must reach out. That's what he tried to do last night.
You talked about the line you liked. What about this line? Republicans want what's best for America, and then the long pause, and so do Democrats.
He referred to the election of 1800 when John Adams turned over power to Thomas Jefferson, the first peaceful transformation of power in our country's history. And Jefferson at that time said, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans," the two major parties at the time. That's what George Bush was trying to do last night. Democrats and Republicans come together. We really have to pull together if we're going to achieve anything.
What do you think about his comments on Al Gore?
I thought they were very gracious and I think somewhat empathetic as to what Al Gore was going through. You know, in the end, these are two grudging gladiators who have enormous respect for each other because only the two of them have experienced the same emotions during the last 35 days.
Well, let's talk for a quick second about performance, not content. They brought him into the Texas Capitol where he had a live audience. So he got to look around the room and address individuals in that audience, which took him away from what we talked about before, that deer-in-the-headlights look of his last address to the nation.
Such an important point. His swagger was gone. He did have a human emotional connection. He was in a Democratic House, introduced by a Democrat, alluded to the late former Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock, a Democrat. I thought the setting and tone were perfect, Matt, because George W. Bush realizes that he cannot govern with a far-right agenda. He's going to have to govern from the center, and last night personified that. And also, Matt, he has to connect with people on a regular basis and not talk above them. He also demonstrated that last night.
All right, Tim, thanks very much. Sit tight. We're going to talk to you more in this half hour, but right now at 8 past the hour, here's Katie.
Matt, thank you. Vice President Gore also called for unity in his concession speech last night. NBC's Claire Shipman is in Washington with more on that speech. Claire, good morning.
Good morning, Katie. You know, Gore wrote most of this speech himself, and his friends and aides say that from the very beginning, he knew what he wanted to say. One friend explained that Gore understood he had a higher bar than most people to make the case he's not a sore loser, that he can be a good loser. He was determined to be generous, not grudging. For example, very pointedly ignoring the advice of some frustrated Democrats that he not use the word concession.
An emotional moment, and one Al Gore fought to avoid for 5 weeks. But with his family and the Liebermans by his side, he offered a heartfelt and magnanimous admission of defeat. The emphasis, healing the nation and good wishes for the president-elect.
I personally will be at his disposal, and I call on all Americans. I particularly urge all who stood with us to unite behind our next president. This is America. Just as we fight hard when the stakes are high, we close ranks and come together when the contest is done.
He even joked about his now famous retracted concession on election night.
Just moments ago, I spoke with George W. Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd president of the United States. And I promised him that I wouldn't call him back this time.
But Gore pointedly admitted to some frustration, even as he formally conceded.
Now the U.S. Supreme Court has spoken. Now the U.S. Supreme Court has spoken. Let there be no doubt. While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession.
There were moments of candor almost unparalleled for the usually restrained vice president. The pain of failing to carry his home state, for example.
As for what I'll do next, I don't know the answer to that one yet. Like many of you, I'm looking forward to spending the holidays with family and old friends. I know I'll spend time in Tennessee and mend some fences, literally and figuratively.
And those who know Gore well say this is a hint that he's sure to try again in 4 years.
Some have asked whether I have any regrets. And I do have one regret, that I didn't get the chance to stay and fight for the American people over the next 4 years, especially for those who need burdens lifted and barriers removed, especially for those who feel their voices have not been heard. I heard you, and I will not forget.
After the speech, throngs of White House staffers stood waiting to cushion his defeat, and Gore set off for home amid their cheers.
And Katie, he came home to a party here at his residence that lasted to the wee hours of the morning. Campaign workers, guests like labor leader John Sweeney, singer John Bon Jovi. From my reporting, Gore was last seen holding onto a bottle of beer, dancing with his wife. Then Tipper was later playing the drums. I'm also told that the Gore family is going to try to get away for a long weekend this weekend, and they're looking for some privacy. So far, they're not telling anyone where they're going, Katie.
All right, Claire Shipman. Claire, thank you very much. Let's check in again with Tim Russert. Tim, it seems to me that Al Gore had to really accomplish 3 things. He had to be magnanimous. He had to express some kind of displeasure with the Supreme Court decision. At least he had to have some kind of response. And he obviously kept the door open for 2004. Do you think he achieved all those things?
3 for 3. He was gracious and credible, Katie. He said he disagreed with the court. He said he was disappointed about losing. He said he was going to go back home and mend fences. All those things are exactly the right tone. People would not have believed him if he said, you know, this doesn't bother me. Congratulations to the winner. Quite the opposite. Al Gore believes very deeply he won this election. I was quite taken by his first phrase, Katie. I congratulate Governor Bush on becoming the president, not winning the election. I thought that was quite striking.
Do you think you're reading too much into that, Tim, or do you think that was a deliberate choice of words?
Oh, I think it was very deliberate, but it does not detract in any way from the extraordinary, magnanimous and gracious speech that Al Gore gave. I thought it was perhaps the best of his career.
Let's talk about his political future. You know, he did say, I will not forget, my only regret that I will not be able to fight for you. Clearly, you got the sense that he was saying, I'll be back. The question is that realistic? Will he be back, Tim?
Well, you know, on election night, if he had lost a clear-cut loss, defeat, most people would have written him off saying, how could a vice president in these economic times lose a race like this? But because of the last 5 weeks and the way he lost, one Gore advisor said, we much prefer to lose by the Supreme Court decision than by a recount, because it will linger in people's minds whether or not we really had won the election. The leader of the Democrats in the Senate, Tom Daschle, leader of the Democrats in the House, Dick Gebhardt, have both said that Al Gore is the leading contender in 2004. I think he'll be challenged. I think, in his words, he'll have to fight for it, but he certainly is very much in the running.
And finally, I know that you and Matt talked about style over substance with George W. Bush. Style-wise, how do you think Al Gore did? He seemed more relaxed than usual and more conversational.
Perfect word. Is the most conversational, self-deprecating speech I've ever heard him give. It's much more like the Al Gore you meet in an informal setting than you have seen on the campaign stump. I think that he did the country an enormous amount of good, and I think he helped himself politically as well.
All right, Tim, thank you so much.
Thanks,
We're going to
Katie.
be talking with you again in a few minutes. It's 7:14. Once again, here's Matt.
Katie, thank you. The question now is, how will a divided Congress function with George W. Bush? Congressman David Bonnier is the House Democratic Whip, a member of the Democratic leadership. Congressman Bonnier, good morning to you.
Good morning. How are you, Matt?
I'm fine, thanks. I know you watched both speeches. Did these guys do enough to put this election controversy behind us?
Well, let's say that they've reached out to each other and they've tried to bind the heels of the country. And I think Tim's comments about the Vice President's speech, where he actually stole every word that I was going to use with respect to the speech itself. It was generous, it was conciliatory, it was self-deprecating in a humorous way, and it was very poignant. I was moved deeply by the Vice President's thoughts about his regrets not being able to fight for people who need to be stood up for.
But you stopped short a second ago of saying this puts the election mess behind us.
Well, I want to say something about the speech by the governor, too, because I thought it was also reaching out. I thought the tone was good. I thought he did express a sense of humility that was I think, appropriate for the results of this election. But one of the things I was disappointed in, and that was this election was more than just, it became more than just about two men or two parties. It became about really the right to vote, and I was disappointed that issue was not addressed. He has to dig a little deeper, I think, and understand the deep, bitter feeling some people still have with respect to the electoral problems that we have in this country.
So when you said on December 3rd, I think it was, quote, I think we have a constitutional crisis in this country and the legitimacy of the presidency is at stake, you still feel that way?
Well, I said that only if, in fact, this went to the Florida legislature and it went to the Congress to be decided. I accept the Vice President view with this, that George Bush is now our elected president and that we have to come together.
Obviously, Governor Bush, now President-elect Bush, was trying very hard to reach across the aisle to Democrats. As someone who will be sitting across that aisle, are Democrats going to be willing, and let's be honest, some are very resentful about what happened here, are they going to be willing to reach back?
I think they will. I think people will come together. I think that the governor can help himself immeasurably. Maybe this wasn't the time or the right place for the speech for him to do the issue of electoral and political reform because it raises, again, the question of the legitimacy problem. But he needs to do that, and I think he needs to do that soon. And when he does that, I think you will find more people reaching and embracing an effort to try to bring people together. He also, the governor, the president-elect, needs to, I think, reach out to his own party and to his own leaders, because I think there is a concern that some of us have in the Congress, and I think the country in general,
right,
that some of his leaders now will want to take him on a path, on a far-right path, and I think that would be dangerous.
Congressman David Bonnier. Congressman, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Representative Christopher Cox is chairman of the Republican Policy Committee. Congressman Cox, good morning to you.
Good morning, Matt.
You just heard what Congressman Bonnier said. Does Governor Bush have more work to do?
Well, of course, he has the entire 4 years of his administration ahead of him now. I met yesterday with Vice President-elect Dick Cheney, who now can begin in earnest the job of the transition. As you've just reported, the money for the transition will finally be made available. The FBI background checks can now begin for potential people serving in the administration. And, of course, the budget of the United States that the President is required to submit 13 days after he's sworn into office can now begin to be prepared in earnest. All of these things normally would have been underway for the last 36 days, but really last night was the end of the election. It was election night for Americans. Usually we see these speeches way before Thanksgiving, and so part of the feeling of relief that was brought about by the two extraordinary speeches, and I agree with all that have gone before me in their conclusions that those were wonderful speeches. Part of the effect of those speeches, and the reason that they were so effective, is that it feels good to stop beating your head against the wall. We've all been unwilling parties to a lawsuit this last month, and it's finally over, and we can begin this process of healing that both the victor and Vice President Gore talked about.
How is George W. Bush going to work with the right in his own party? People who supported him during the campaign are now going to say, okay, all this talk about reaching across and working with the Democrats is great, but we've got some things on our agenda that we want to get done.
Well, I think the same way that you work with people on the left. What I have found consistently in the leadership in the Congress is that we are successful in our legislative endeavors when we focus on substance, when we work on the things that the American people care about. When President Bush, President-elect Bush last night talked about reconciliation, he followed it quickly with progress. That's what people expect and want. We can set aside our differences best when we find common ground, not on everything, but on those things that are before us. Obviously, the themes that President-elect and Vice President-elect Bush and Cheney respectively selected for their campaign have a lot of bipartisan prospect. Tax relief is something that Vice President Gore himself campaigned on. Education reform. Everyone wants to improve our public schools, and it's vital that we do so. Local control is a means of doing so that both Democrats and Republicans can agree on. So I think we have a great opportunity ahead of us, and I'm glad that we're finally getting started on it.
Congressman Cox, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Once again,
let there be no
opportunity ahead of us, and I'm glad that we're finally getting started on it.
Congressman Cox, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Once again, here's Katie.
All right, Matt, let's go back one more time to Tim Russert. Tim, we know that the first 100 days of any presidency is critical. What will be on George Bush's agenda, and will there be gridlock in Congress or compromise?
Well, the very first thing will be an education measure where I think he can develop pretty strong bipartisan consensus. He'll try to eliminate the marriage penalty and taxes and the estate tax. Both those will pass. I think his biggest obstacle, Katie, will be fellow Republican John McCain, who will put forward a campaign finance package, which is very popular with Democrats, and there's a very good chance that could wind up on President Bush's desk.
And that's something he doesn't support, so how hard will that be for him?
He may have to. It will be a real test for him as to whether or not he can put together this bipartisan consensus he's talking about.
We heard, oh, go ahead, sorry.
You know, on the conservative side, Tom DeLay, the Republican whip in the House, said yesterday, this now gives us an unfettered path to a conservative agenda because we have a Republican president, Republican House, Republican Senate. A lot of people around George W. Bush know that is exactly not the way to go. In 1952 was the last time we had a Republican president, House, and Senate. It lasted just 2 years, Katie, until the midterm election of '54. A lot of Democrats are lying in wait. Looking at 2002, George W. Bush has to be very careful and very cautious that whatever he does, he keep this consensus going, stand by principle, but also achieve results.
What about Dave Bonnier? He's obviously hankering for some election reform, as are many Americans, frankly. Will he tackle that?
Absolutely. I think there has to be some uniform standards around the country. People do not want to relive Florida, Florida, Florida in the year 2004. And that will receive very strong bipartisan consensus. If there is a surplus, why not allocate some money to make sure that our election days run much more smoothly?
And they may be tired of that little board of yours, too, Dan.
Merry Christmas to you, Katie.